Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, those listening in and watching live, and those who will subsequently be watching the recording. It's my pleasure and honor on behalf of Father Nicholas Kazarian to welcome you to this second webinar organized by the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. Thank you for joining us for this Greening the Parish initiative that features conversations among expert panelists on what it means to be a steward of creation through the lens of our Christian theology, the best of our practices, and in our daily action. Let me begin with a prayer from the Orthodox Vespers for Creation. Almighty God, who created all things with wisdom, and who watches over and guides them by your all-powerful hand, grant well-being that all creation may prosper and remain unharmed. For you, Master, commanded that the works of your hands should remain unshaken until the end of the age. You spoke, and they came into being, and they received from you mercy, for the turning away of all harm, and for the salvation of the human race, which glorifies your name, that is praised above all. Amen. Let me, from the outset, convey, as I did yesterday, the personal blessing of His All Holiness, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, who yesterday conveyed to me his delight at this series of webinars and his support for the work to green our parishes. He is especially happy that we're including this evening the voices of our ecumenical friends and partners. One of the cornerstones of the ecological vision and voice of His All Holiness has been the inclusion of other communities, of other churches. As he likes to say, we're all in the same boat. Beyond this, I believe that the ecumenical perspective of the Patriarch's witness and work in the area of creation care is based on a spirit of sincere humility and readiness to learn from other Christian confessions, many of which have made sound progress in responding to the challenge and repercussions of climate change in today's society. And this panel features very distinguished preachers and practitioners from our ecumenical partners in this shared effort. I am convinced that there is an ecumenical imperative to creation care. Our relationship with creation evokes and affirms our interconnectedness as human beings. The earth, creation, unites us all above and beyond any doctrinal differences and even beyond any political interests. We may or may not share religious principles or expectations, but we most definitely share an experience of the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the ground that we tread, albeit not always fairly or justly. So by some mysterious connection that we do not always understand, that we do not always appreciate, and in fact, that we sometimes choose not to remember or even to resist, the earth first unites us. Because whenever we narrow religious life to ourselves and our own, we actually neglect our vocation to reconcile and transform all of creation. And that's precisely the power of ecumenism that motivates us to open up to others, to speak the language of care and compassion, to give priority to sharing and service. And in this respect, creation care has a vital ecumenical dimension, inasmuch as it brings us divided, insulated believers before a common task that we must inevitably face together. As the Ecumenical Patriarch stated in his latest encyclical for the Day of Prayer for Creation last September 1st, the integrity of the natural environment is the shared responsibility of all inhabitants of the earth. Spiritula.
Thank you, Father John. And I just really love what you said about the earth does belong to all of us, and really here we are all together. So I'm really excited to begin this evening. And I just want to thank again our panelists for being with us, and especially our audience for being with us here on a Friday evening as well. So I'm really excited to begin our second conversation on greening the parish and focusing on ecumenical practices. And again, really excited to have the conversation tonight with our panelists. Before I begin, I would like to remind the audience to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you may have throughout the conversation. Questions will be presented to the panel at the last part of our time together. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. Ms. Shantha Reddy Alonso currently serves as the Executive Director of Creation Justice Ministries. The Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt-Jonas serves as Missioner for Creation Care in the 2 Episcopal Dioceses of Massachusetts and in the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. Reverend Dr. Jim Antal currently serves as Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. The Reverend Dr. Leah D. Schade is an Assistant Professor of Preaching and Worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky, an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Of course, a lot more can be said about the achievements of each person and their ministry, and we are very honored to welcome each of you tonight. For the audience, you can read more about each person through the link that has been posted in the chat. I would now like to begin our conversation. Margaret, let's begin with you. What can the global pandemic teach us about addressing the climate crisis?
It's a great question, and I want to begin by acknowledging that yesterday the United States experienced the largest death toll yet from the coronavirus. So our hearts go out to everyone who's been ill, everyone who has died, and everyone who mourns. I think of the pandemic as being a big wake-up call. That's the big lesson we can get from this pandemic. And I'd like to just quickly walk through some of the lessons we can learn if we're paying attention. Maybe the first lesson to learn is that science matters. Facts matter. You know, scientists were saying for quite a long time that there was, as human populations pushed up against wild areas and wild creatures, that there was a risk that diseases in animals would jump over, spill over into human populations. And apparently that's exactly what happened with the pandemic. And in the same way, scientists have been warning for years about the risks of burning fossil fuels and of cutting down forests, saying that we're pushing the planetary limits, possibly to a point of no return where it will be increasingly difficult for the web of life as it has evolved to survive, and even for civilization to continue. And just hours ago, we got some more news saying that 2020 was tied as the hottest year with 2016, and that the hottest decade on record is the last decade, and that we now know that the average global temperature has risen 1.25 degrees Celsius average temperature rise of our Earth because of burning fossil fuels, which pushes us that much closer to the 1.5 degree limit of what scientists tell us our planet can tolerate without spilling over into massive sea level rise, droughts, floods, extreme storms, and so on. So both the pandemic and climate change tell us science matters, and the quicker we take action, the more lives we will save, the more suffering we will avert. A second thing we've learned from the pandemic is that we can make changes quickly if we want to. You know, in these last months, most of us just changed our lives on a dime. Most of us stopped traveling, most of us stopped flying, most of us are wearing masks. It's the same, we changed our lifestyles to protect ourselves and to protect our neighbors. And similarly, as individuals and a society, we can make changes very quickly around what kind of energy we burn and how we live, if we have the will to do so. The pandemic has pushed us to reframe everything we're doing right now in terms of the pandemic, and the climate crisis does that as well. A third thing we've learned is that a global public health crisis such as the pandemic affects everybody, but it affects us unequally. And we've learned that low-income communities, racial minorities are suffering and dying disproportionately from the coronavirus in large numbers. And it's the same thing with climate change. Those populations that are hurt first and worst from a changing climate are low-income individuals and communities, often racial minorities, the historically marginalized. So that both the pandemic and climate change show us that societies that address social and economic inequality are those that are most likely to hold together in a crisis. And that brings me to the next thing, which is very much on our mind this week in the United States. To hold a society together and to face a global crisis requires strong leadership. We need leaders who tell people the truth. We need leaders who don't lie about the coronavirus or about climate change. We need leaders who help us to stick together and don't turn us against each other. We need leaders who keep firmly in mind the needs of those who are most vulnerable. And I would like quickly to say there is a difference, an important difference between the pandemic and climate change, which is this. There are some corporations that are profiting handsomely from the pandemic. But I don't know of a single corporation that is saying that the coronavirus is a good thing or that we should be promoting the coronavirus. And that's a difference with climate change, because we know that big oil and big gas have been, for years, have been deceiving the American public, misleading us, and telling us that it's not a problem to burn fossil fuels. There's nothing to see there. And that means when it comes to climate change that we've got a fight on our hands. We're up against some very big economic corporate forces that are against us. I will close by saying we are the vaccine. We are the vaccine for climate change. We can make changes in our own personal lives to cut our carbon footprint and to live more gently and more simply. But even more important, we can help to build and to join a movement for life. Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. We can join that life-giving, life-sustaining, faith-filled, spirit-filled, justice-seeking movement to protect the web of life and to leave a habitable world for our children. We're the vaccine.
Thank you, Margaret. And definitely the scope of what you're showing too is the international impact of the pandemic and also of climate change. So Shantha, I want to turn to you next and really ask then, what does Greening the Parish at a local level have to do with keeping the global and international promises that have been made in the Paris Climate Agreement, for example?
Yeah, thanks for that question. First off, I want to just say that I greatly anticipate the day that we rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. The United States is all alone in its lack of participation right now, and the nature of the climate crisis is absolutely global. It reminds us how we are all so interconnected and interreliant. And so I'm looking forward to the new commitment to get back into that international community of commitment. So what does it mean at the parish level if you're saying, all right, I'm going to sign my parish on to this greening initiative? What does that connect to? How does that connect to that big agreement? What does installing energy efficient light bulbs have to do with this international agreement? Well, there are 4 things I want to call to your attention. One is very obvious. Yes, the parish is a place with building and grounds, and they can be managed in a green way. But 2, the parish is a place of moral authority. 3, the parish is a place of learning. And 4, the parish is a place of community building. So in terms of the building and grounds, it may feel insignificant to go around changing your light bulbs and making sure the insulation is tight in the winter. But those are sacred acts that are your participation And your participation matters very much in ensuring that we meet these climate goals at an individual level. And they feed into the second point, your parish's moral authority. If we are being the change that we are seeking to make in the world, that is a contagious, in a good way. We just talked about a pandemic. It is a contagious action. And people will be compelled by that moral authority and that moral model and want to participate. And that brings us to the next point. People will experience learning. If you are doing your homework about what the best practices are to make your parish a green place, a place where not only is the physical facility and the grounds well managed and green, but also you're doing ecological education and seamlessly integrating that into your theological formation activities, people are going to start taking that home. And they're going to start seeing that as a key part of their own lifestyle and their own way that they live out their faith with their family at home. We were just discussing about the pandemic. We are learning that as we experience crises, and the climate crisis is going to bring more and more emergencies to our doorsteps, we are going to need each other, and we're going to find that congregations are hubs of resilience to weather both the material and spiritual storms that are ahead of us.
Thank you, Shantha. And I really appreciate the hub that you're saying, because really the parishes are a center for learning and spiritual growth, and really are key in making these small changes. Leah, I would like to turn to you now, as we mentioned this past year, 2020, and there's a lot going on in our world, in our country, and a lot of these issues also can be taken in different ways and different perspectives. And this was brought up a little bit last night in our webinar too, but I want to ask you then, what is the role of preaching and teaching in Greening the Parish? And also, how can clergy address creation issues when they become so politicized in our current times?
That's a great question, and it really builds on what Shantha was talking about. What I've been finding in my research with clergy and congregations is that when pastors do try to talk to their congregations, especially when there is when there's political divisiveness, things that should be for the common good, like caring for God's creation, have become so politicized that when pastors try to talk about it, they get negative pushback from their parishioners. And they'll say, well, you can't talk about climate change, or you can't talk about cleaning up the local river because that's too political. And that is really a tool to shut down people and to those who they think they are pushing a liberal agenda, which is ridiculous, because it's not a liberal agenda. This is God's agenda. Caring for creation is rooted in Scripture from the very beginning. Human beings are entrusted with caring for the garden in Genesis 2:15, to till and to keep. All throughout Scripture, there is this relationship between God, God's people, and God's creation. And so this is not about some kind of political agenda. There is theological and scriptural foundations for this. So what I think is really important is for pastors, for preachers, for lay leaders to do a lot of education, and Shantha had mentioned this as well, to help people make those connections between what we say about God and who God is and what God does, and how we respond to that as people of faith. That when we are advocating for stronger regulations to protect the water, the air, the land, that is a sacred act. That is an act of prayer. That is an act of the church doing what God has called us to do. We're celebrating the baptism of Jesus for those of us who are following that the liturgical year in that way. And so we have to be thinking about, how do we protect the very waters in which we baptize. This is part of our baptismal vocation as Christians, to care for the water, to care for the land that will produce the bread and the wine that is the body of and blood of Christ. So when we connect all of this scripturally, educationally, liturgically, homiletically, this helps people to say, okay, this is actually integrated and part and parcel to my faith as a Christian. And so doing this is not a political thing, it is part of my faith. So I'm hoping that pastors, priests, rabbis, all kinds of faith leaders will take this as their sacred trust with their congregations going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. And really, when you were saying God's agenda, the image that came to mind for me was the Orthodox style icon of like Christ in that moment, but God creating creation and the universe and the animals and then man and woman. And just that image of really, you're right, like this is a sanctification of creation. So I want to turn now to Jim and ask you that you've been talking a lot about this for over a decade, that clergy and congregations really need to engage the climate crisis as the greatest moral issue that humanity has ever faced. So can you tell us why you think it's important for people of faith to engage the climate crisis?
Before I answer that directly, I just want to say what an honor it is to be on this screen with my friends Leah and Shantha and Margaret. And spiritually, you and John are just doing a fabulous job with this series that you have set up. So there are a lot of reasons. Let me give three, and the first one really builds on what Leah has just said. As Psalm 24 tells us, the earth is the Lord's. It's not ours to wreck. People of faith have allowed the climate crisis to become an ideological dispute. If the earth is the Lord's and the earth is being rendered uninhabitable by the greed and abuse of only a few generations, then it's up to people of faith to intervene on God's behalf. Now, a second reason it's so important for people of faith to engage the climate crisis is this. Addressing climate change requires the greatest social change in history. And throughout history, significant social change has only happened when people of conscience have been awake and focused. The church helped lead an end to slavery. It supported women's suffrage, civil rights, voting rights, and most recently, LGBTQI rights. We must do so again as we address the long emergency of the climate crisis. And a third reason is directed at clergy and also echoes some of what Leah said a moment ago. We are trusted leaders. If thousands of clergy made it clear from their pulpits that restoring God's creation is our generation's unifying calling, the momentum to make the most profound changes, that momentum would be unstoppable.
Thank you, Jim. And I think one of the main points you're making too is that churches are really important in social change. And at the same time, I know that policy and government level is also really important. So Shantha, I want to ask you next, how does public policy engagement relate with Greening the Parish at a local level?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my previous comments, I talked about how, when we think about greening the parish, we think about our insulation and our light bulbs, and also including themes of caring for God's creation and our faith formation activities. But public policy too is something that faith communities are very committed to working on at the at higher levels, and this is something that can be done at the parish level as well. So I'll start by talking about a bit about Creation Justice Ministries and how things work with us. My organization is a membership organization of major Christian denominations, communions, and fellowships. We work at the federal policy level in the United States, and we find our policy positions based on the religious bodies that are our members. and what they have already said in whatever official capacity they have set up through issuing of statements or encyclicals or other church policies, we see what the consensus is. And the consensus very broadly and very strongly is that we must enact our moral responsibility to care for God's creation. And that is a very powerful witness. We may not agree how to celebrate communion or how to ordain or how to go about baptizing. But as Christians, we are very, very unified in our understanding of our moral responsibility to care for God's creation. And that is the bottom line that I work from when I engage on public policies, is that we are united in this. Now, what does that look like? Well, the Paris Climate Agreement is one very good example of a time when many religious communities organized within their own respective denominations, communions, and fellowships, and also brought collective witness through ecumenical as well as interfaith efforts for petition drives and speaking engagements and opinion editorial writing and visits with policymakers in Congress and the administration, building the will, building the public understanding about why this Paris Agreement would be consistent with our moral understanding of how we are meant to relate to creation and each other. Now, what does that mean for somebody who wants to green their parish and have a public policy aspect to greening your parish? Well, Creation Justice Ministries offers a monthly action center that has tools to equip people who want to do just that. And if you go to creationjustice.org/action, you will find the Action Center. It always has one bulletin insert, one advocacy action that you can take to send a message to Congress or to the administration, and a series of events that you can participate in, many of which involve policy education to become up to date on issues that may affect your parish. For example, on January 21st, we are hosting a webinar featuring Congressman Don McEachin, who is the co-chair of the U.S. House Environmental Justice Task Force. He also happens to be a minister. And he will be talking with us about opportunities for climate resilience policies in the new Congress and administration. So every month we have opportunities like that. The action this month is to ensure that there is a moratorium on water utility shutoffs, while it is vital that everybody has access to safe, clean water to be able to wash their hands in the midst of the pandemic. So I invite anyone who is working on greening their parish to think beyond the immediate walls of the parish and think about how your participation in public policy actions is also a part of that greening.
Thank you, Shantha. I think that was a really helpful way to look at how sometimes the top level feels so far away, and that was really practical. And I really would like to now invite Leah to expand on this practicality of how congregations can move from talk to action, as you were giving a little bit of a background, Shantha, there. But also, Leah, then how can we put our faith into action and actually taking action on these issues, the environment and climate crisis?
Yeah, great question. When I first started doing this work about a decade ago, I was working under the assumption that as long as we, preached a good sermon and just explained to people why it was important to do this, that people would just respond and it would be fine. And we really haven't gotten the traction that we have needed. The church has not been greening to the degree that it needs to, and to the scale and with the urgency that it needs to. So I'm actually going to draw on an idea that that Jim had in a book that Margaret and I co-edited called Rooted and Rising. He suggested that we really need to set some concrete goals, measurable goals. And one of the things that he said was that leaders need to be dedicating 25% of their time to climate action. And so I started thinking about that and saying, okay, that means congregations need to be doing this as well. And so I broke it down because I've been working with congregations, and so 25% seems like, wow, that's like, 0 to 25 in a short period of time can feel a little overwhelming. So I said, well, let's break this into smaller steps. What if we started with what I would call the creation tithe, where you think about what are ways that we can take 10% of our time, our resources, and our human resources, and dedicate them to climate action. Maybe that means that we drive 10% less, or we reduce our meat consumption by 10%, or we sign up 10% of the congregation for clean energy. So we start with that, start in steps, and then we go to the next step, the next, double tithe. And we think about, okay, how can we reduce our energy consumption by 20%? How can we dedicate 20% of our benevolent fund to congregations of color that don't have the same kind of resources, that they might want to put solar panels on their church, or want to do some energy efficiency? So maybe we can do that. And then the final 5%, the strive for 5 is what I call it, is to say, how can we take that last step to really push us up to that 25%? So you might say, can we take 5% of donations from our congregation and maybe put a scholarship together that would fund the education of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be in the fields of sustainability and environmental science, and enable them to have that education so that we can sort of have this all hands on deck. And if our congregation supports people who have not had access to resources, then we are sharing our wealth, our resources in a way that lifts everyone. And then the last thing I'll say about this is it can't just be at the congregational level. This has to be more than just grassroots. It's got to be the treetops. It has to be denominational leaders, judicatory leaders, setting concrete goals for their clergy and their congregations. And this can be something that's kind of fun, if we're gonna start with the creation tithe, and we're gonna challenge all of our congregations within the next 6 months. Let's see who can get there fastest, and there's little prizes or whatever. But if we don't set goals, if we don't establish a baseline of where we are now, set some goals, then we won't really know what we're measuring, and if we're succeeding, and what we need to do to increase some things. So I think it has to go beyond just the sermons to really setting goals and putting things in place that we can meet those goals as congregations.
Thank you, Leah. I know I took some notes there on the creation tithe, so I'm excited to talk to my parish about that. But I think that's a great idea, and I really appreciated clearly the lessons that you've learned throughout it. So Margaret, I want to invite you also to share that you've been involved in climate activism for a very long time as well. So what are some of the things that you've learned along the way that you could offer to us? Oh, you're still muted. Great.
You're reminding me that being engaged in the faith-based climate movement is a great way to keep learning, and it's also a great way to meet some really fine people. And I'm glad to be on this call with some really fine people. I'll just name quickly 3 things I've learned along the way. There's a lot more, but here are just 3. One is the big word intersectionality. Honestly, when I started at this so many years ago, people who cared about the environment were mostly white people, mostly middle class and upper class people, mostly focused on protecting wild areas, big, beautiful wild wilderness areas. Well, that's fantastic. But in recent years, we are increasingly aware that that's inadequate and that we need to be listening to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The same mindset that is willing to extract, it's an extractive, I think of it as a white supremacy mindset, is the same mindset that allows us to exploit and dominate the earth, is the same mindset that allows us to exploit and dominate other human beings. So we're talking about a big transformation of consciousness here, where we need to build an intersectional movement where we understand that all these issues that we care about are intimately connected. So we're talking not just about a little tiny change, a little bit of an adjustment to business as usual, but a transformative level of change. So that's one thing I'm learning. A second thing I'm learning, this is kind of humbling to admit, but I'm learning that connecting with the earth is a spiritual practice. When I first started this work, I really imagined it as we are going to save the earth. And I'm realizing, yes, amen, we need to do that. But I'm also realizing we also need to be saved by the earth. It's a mutual relationship of healing. Most of us human beings, including myself, are in some ways very estranged from the natural rhythms of the earth. And it is so healing to spend time outdoors. And this is one thing I really value in Orthodox theology, is you've never lost that mystical sense that God infuses and sustains and reveals God's self through the natural world. So it's become a spiritual practice for me, and it's a lot of what I teach in my retreats, is how to go outside and learn to encounter the divine in the tree, in the wind, in the soil, in this present moment where God is giving God's self to us through the natural world. So it's becoming a spiritual practice for me. And the third thing I'll say is I'm also learning about grief, that as people of faith, I think this is one of the great gifts that communities of faith can actually offer human beings in this perilous time, is contexts in which we can grieve the enormous losses that we've already experienced and that we are likely to experience in the days ahead. So to allow ourselves to tell God the truth of how we feel, our rage about what's happening to the earth and what human beings are doing to the earth and to each other, our shame about that, our guilt, our remorse, our sorrow. To me, this is sacred work. It's not ancillary. It's right at the core of what it means to me to be a faithful Christian. I take heart that Jesus wept. And then when we are weeping for the earth and her people, her communities, we know that Jesus is weeping with us. And through his Spirit, we will receive the strength and the power then to rise up and to take our part in the movement for life. So those are some things I'm learning.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. And it reminds me of the word in Greek that means like joyful sorrow, or karmolipi, because it's the same time we're seeing the beauty of creation, but also you're saying, I think is really important, the grief of what we've done and what is happening around us. So Jim, I want to turn to you in this kind of same idea and theme of grief and these different things. But this past week in the Journal for Nature Climate Change that was featured in Time magazine, it indicated that if the whole world were to stop releasing carbon dioxide and methane today, the carbon pollution we've already released would nevertheless push global temperatures to over 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 2.3 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. So knowing all of this, how do you encourage people to be hopeful?
Well, the first thing I want to say is to echo what Margaret said about grief. And, churches and houses of worship are places where we can process our grief, and we're accustomed to that. And now they need to include in that processing of grief, the grief over creation as we are losing it. But there's one other thing that I want to emphasize, and that is that I believe, and every place I speak, I talk about, we need what I believe is a new understanding of hope, that we have to embrace hope as engagement and exercise hope as if it were a muscle. Greta Thunberg says it that way, and she can teach me theology all day and night. Hope is a discipline. It's a commitment to the future manifest as action. For example, Harriet Tubman's life illustrates what I mean by this understanding of hope. Reverend Carol Brooks lifts up this understanding that if Harriet Tubman compared, if she compared the 70 slaves that she managed to free to the 4 million slaves that remained enslaved, she would have given up. But her hope and leadership were not based on the dire math of reality, but they were based on a calculation of faith. Hope is not empirically demonstrated, nor does it have anything to do with optimism. To be a person of hope is a moral choice. And God calls us to affirm the moral choice to live by hope every single day. Every day we engage the challenge, every day we defend God's creation, every day we use our God-given gifts to change the system, we participate in a hope-filled universe. And I think Mary Oliver, the wonderful poet so often quoted by theologians, puts it very well. She says, "It is a serious thing just to be alive on this fresh morning in this broken world."
Thank you, Jim. That just makes me so grateful to wake up every morning. But thank you for the reminder too, because that is so beautiful. And Shantha, I want to invite you to talk a little bit more directly. We brought up this question of everyone does not have equal experiences in this world, and especially we've seen this in the pandemic and in climate change. So could you speak to us a little bit more about what this looks like in relation to these challenges and in regards to injustice specifically?
Yeah, well, I have a narrower example, and then I will zoom out a bit. So we started out talking about the connection between the pandemic and the climate crisis. It has been empirically shown now in a few different ways that if you have been living with a disproportionate burden of pollution in your community, that you are also disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of the coronavirus. And we also know that communities of color, for a lot of reasons, are disproportionately vulnerable to dying from the coronavirus. The virus does not discriminate in who gets infected by it, but the infection takes hold and takes advantage of the toll that years of pollution take on people's bodies as they take that into their lungs and into their systems. So that is the immediate injustice that is just very egregious that we are living through right now. And it's so painful. I also want to back up and talk a little bit about how the church has always understood the church's mission to be with the most vulnerable. And Creation Justice Ministries, which used to be the National Council of Churches Eco-Justice Program, about 10 years ago, issued this groundbreaking report called Climate and Church: How Global Climate Change Will Affect Core Church Ministries. And core church ministries, we would consider to be hunger relief, refugee resettlement, disaster response. And what we tried to do was to actually put numbers to, okay, if the climate crisis were to accelerate in the way that we're learning is projected, how much would it cost for churches to step in and try to address the natural consequences of the hunger that would result from massive droughts and disruption of our farming systems? How much would it cost to resettle people whose homes are encroached upon by storm surge and sea level rise, and the inability to live in places that they've lived in for generation because it's just too hot? What does it mean for the disaster response ministries of the churches when these 100-year floods and 1,000-year storms are hitting us with increasing frequency? And it's hard to wrap our heads around, but we hoped that issuing that report would give people a little idea of what the call of the church is to actually do the prevention that we need to do as quickly as we can and as much as we can now, because every bit of prevention now means that those core relief ministries are concerned for the most vulnerable, that we will have less of those disasters in the future, and we will be able to manage them just a little bit better.
Thanks, Shantha. Sorry, I froze a little bit at the end, but I really appreciate that perspective. And also then kind of turning a little bit differently, I want to invite Margaret now to talk about kind of the initiatives that you're involved in currently and what you're really excited about within that.
Well, thanks. I'll just mention a few of the things I'm doing that I am truly excited about. One is that in Massachusetts, we're launching something called the Good News Gardens movement, which is this pretty new effort to connect food and faith, bring those two together. So it's all about encouraging individuals and congregations to plant vegetable gardens, get some food growing, you know, rip out that pointless lawn that's full of pesticides and whatever, and put in a community garden. And the idea is to plant extra so that you know you're going to be donating some portion of what you're growing to the hungry. So it's also a way of addressing food insecurity. And we're liking this idea because it's something you can do outdoors. You can do it even in the midst of a pandemic. And it has the possibility of bringing together different classes of people, different kinds of people, as together we try to figure out how to grow food. You know, I'm the last person in the world to, you know, I don't grow food. So we're bringing in people who know how to do this, you know, some master gardeners who can coach us. And it's an ecumenical effort. I'd love it to become an interfaith effort. But that feels like something just really kind of sweet and practical that we can do. And everyone we've talked to is really happy about it. Also, a second thing I'm excited about is I've had this dream for ages that I would love there to be a stronger interfaith climate movement. Over the years, I've gone to gazillions of prayer vigils and rallies and protests, and I've joined in civil disobedience. And I would love for there to be a more organized faith-based movement to save life on earth. And so I'm delighted that here in Massachusetts, our local branch of Interfaith Power and Light, which you probably know is a national organization, you know, it's all across the United States. And they organize Interfaith Power and Light organizes, does a lot of support and coaching around Earth Day on April 22nd, so that congregations everywhere can have a special time of focusing on creation care during that week in April. But anyway, our local branch of Interfaith Power and Light in Massachusetts is focusing a lot on mobilizing people of faith around political advocacy. So there's some climate bills right now at our state house in Boston, and you know they need to get passed. And I wish we had more organized ways of saying, you know, get on the phone. This is a faith-based issue. Call your representative. So I'm excited about putting energy into that. And finally, honestly, I spend a lot of time these days leading retreats, and I'm just eager to support people in finding their own path to connecting with God through the natural world. You know, it's a perception, the perception of the sacredness of the natural world is something that Indigenous peoples have not lost. And we have so much to learn from our Native American friends and allies about what it means to actually live in right relationship with Mother Earth. So I feel very drawn to exploring the spiritual dimension of this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. And it's similar to what Shantha was saying, was said before too, just the intersectionality that you were saying before, Margaret, too, of all these things. I love that, again, the food in the church, growing the garden is fantastic. And Leah, I want to invite you also to share with us some of the current initiatives that you're excited about and working on.
Thank you. Where I teach at Lexington Theological Seminary, we recognize the need to equip our students to be able to think about creation care in their congregations. And so we began a creation care certificate program for this year. And so we have classes in pastoral care, ethics. I'm teaching one on creation crisis preaching and worship based on a book that I wrote, and a series of classes so that our students can think about how to integrate the care of what has been entrusted to us into their ministries. One of the things that we did as just before we started this certificate program was to send out a survey that I put together to try to get a baseline on where are our students in terms of their attitudes about creation care, their experiences, what's going on in their churches, like is there a creation care committee or like an eco ministry committee? Do they have upgraded lighting? Things like that. So we could see here's where we are right now. And after our students have gone through this year-long certificate program with these different courses, what difference will it make in their congregations and in their own ministries? So we'll do a follow-up survey at the end of the year to see what has changed. Again, trying to measure that, you know, here's what we thought we were going to do, but maybe we didn't quite succeed the way we wanted to. We need to tweak some things. Because one of the goals of our seminary, and I'm hoping that more theological education will go in this direction. One of the things we're trying to do is to really be a standout for people seeking theological education to know, okay, this is a place where I can be trained in this as a pastor. So the Lexington is affiliated with the Disciples of Christ Christian Church, and they have a very robust creation care program called Green Chalice, and they actually will certify churches, and so we are the first Green Chalice Seminary and are working on our Green Chalice certification. So my area is in academia, but it's flowing out to the churches from there.
That's awesome. I hope one day that we can have a similar certification, but this is where we have you all, and God willing, continue to work together moving forward. Jim, I want to invite you, there's a lot of different things we talked about. Some of it is heavier than some of the other things. So I want to ask you what you see as signs of hope in all of this.
Well, the first sign of hope I want to lift up echoes the big word that Margaret used earlier and others have used also, intersectionality. You know, it's the growing recognition led by William Barber and Lennox Yearwood, and also being led by scientists like Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, that economic justice, racial justice, and climate justice are all interconnected. Another sign of hope is that people are recognizing the need for us to change the system, the entire system. You know, we're all very accustomed to doing work on the demand side of the fossil fuel problem through recycling and all sorts of things like that. But now we're beginning to focus on the supply side as well. I'll just give one example of that. The Keystone XL pipeline has yet to be completed. In 2011, 1,253 of us were arrested. In 2016, Obama canceled it. In 2017, Trump reinstated it, but legal battles and activists have delayed it. And in 2 weeks, Biden will add it to the list of hundreds of pipelines that have been canceled forever. And I say forever because now it's the case that solar and wind are now the least expensive forms of energy in most of the world. Americans need to know that today solar costs 1/300th what it cost when Jimmy Carter put it on the roof of the White House in 1978. So we don't need the oil from the Canadian tar sands through the KXL or through Line 3 or through any of those other things. And because of that, another sign of hope is that although the Trump administration opened up bidding for the Arctic National Wildlife Preserve, no major oil company has issued a bid. One of the greatest signs of hopes is the surge in the youth climate activism, inspired by Greta Thunberg, but also driven by the Sunrise Movement. They got arrested in Nancy Pelosi's office a little over 2 years ago. And as a result of their arrests, 53 of them arrested in her office, the Green New Deal was born. And finally, I'll just give one other concrete example of a sign of hope, and that's the divestment movement. In 2013, my denomination, the United Church of Christ, became the first religious body and the first national body to vote to divest from fossil fuels. But I never imagined, and I can tell you Bill McKibben never imagined, that today portfolios worth $14.5 trillion have purged their holdings of any fossil fuel stock. So for me, that's a huge sign of hope. And let me just sign off by saying every single day, I am nurtured by the signs of hope offered by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, as well as Pope Francis, and also the Dalai Lama, who has a new book coming out on climate change.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, thank you for really leaving us with signs of hope and different things to really look for and to continue to work in this movement. We are a little pressed for time, so I'm only going to ask the panelists one question, and we have some question and answers, and we do get all the questions so we can connect the audience with the panelists to have those answered. So my question to the panelists is, because this webinar series is really targeting our Orthodox Christian parishes, I would like to ask each of you what you recommend to our parishes as next steps, how to move forward from this conversation, and anything you want to offer in that way. So, well, you're welcome to just chime in, unless Jim, your video is on. I mean, your microphone is open, so you're welcome to go ahead.
I'll just build on one of the ideas Margaret launched, and that is, during World War II, 80% of Methodist parishes converted their front lawns to gardens.
Wow.
Why couldn't we do that today? Margaret's leading the way.
And I'll just add to that. The more we can make this something that we talk about as a matter of faith, it's easy enough. It's easy enough to do an Adult Ed series. Leah mentioned the book that we co-edited, Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. Father John has written a beautiful chapter in that book. That makes fantastic group study. That would be my suggestion. It's got study questions, it's got spiritual practices, it's got lots of stories from faith leaders about how they find spiritual resilience and capacity to keep addressing the crisis.
Thank you. And Leah, Shantha, if you have any, would love for you all to offer some closing remarks as well in that kind of area.
Yeah, one of the things that I would recommend is to connect with people who are already doing the work, who can be a partner with you, mentor you in the areas that you're not quite as strong in. One of the things that I've learned in this work is, as difficult and sometimes depressing as it can be, I have made some of the best friends in this that I would never have met any other way. Just for example, when Margaret and I worked on this book, Rooted and Rising, we developed a friendship all online, and we have never even met in person yet. And yet we have this friendship, and we have this sort of spiritual, soulful connection that has sustained me in this work, and connecting with people like Jim and Shantha, and just we know that we are not alone in this. And that's very important in order to keep us from falling into what I call the dark night of the green soul. It's really important to stay connected with people that can keep you in what my colleague Emily Askew says, keep you in the proximity of hope. Even if you can't feel it yourself, be in the proximity of hope.
Thank you, Leah. If you don't mind, if you could hold up the book again, I think people would just like to note it down.
Yes. There you go. Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis.
Thank you. And Shantha, I want to invite you also to offer some closing remarks, and then I'll close us out.
Yeah, I would concur. This work must be done in community, and our organization, we have a strong e-community where people sign up to get our emails. And then I receive individual emails from so many people every year who say, I am the only person at my church who cares about this. I am trying to carry the eco-justice banner at my church, and I feel like I am the only one. And my response to them usually is, are you sure you're the only one? Like, where else could you find some other person, one or two other people? Because where two or three are gathered, God is in your midst, and beautiful things will happen. And this work cannot be done in isolation. It has to be done in community. We need each other. So I just dropped into the chat box a reference to the eco-justice resource on our website, where two or three are gathered, eco-justice as community. We made that resource to give people some community organizing ideas and ways to connect with other people around these issues, and to start gathering people together in some sort of a team, a creation care or a creation justice team where you can work together, because we heard from so many folks that felt isolated in doing this.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you, because I think this just really is a testament to working together in the partnership we have, obviously, as ecumenical partners and as Christians, really first and foremost. So thank you to each of you for being with us tonight, for all the wisdom that you share with us. Thank you also to our audience for being with us tonight. And also just want to say a thank you again to the department, to Father Nicholas, Father John, and Nick, who is behind the scenes helping out. So thank you to all of you. And thank you to the audience. When you X out, there'll be a 2-minute survey. If you could fill it out, that would be fantastic. If you have any remaining questions, you can also write them in there, and we will make sure to contact you. And next week, we will also have 2 more webinars to close out our series on Thursday, January 14th at 6 p.m. is the next one. And that will focus on communities at work, where we're going to look at practical implementation on the ground and what that looks like. So if you registered with this link, it'll be the same link, and you can just pop into that. So just again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for watching and being with us. And we are looking forward to seeing you all next week.